We are starting today, we're talking a little Pride Month escapade through motorsport history. I know a lot of folks tend to think of motorsport very masculine, very heteronormative. We have had women, queer folks, people of color, racing since the very start of motorsport, back in the late 1800s. So I want to celebrate a couple of those folks today because I think their stories matter. I do just want to share, before we get started, a little content warning. Some of these folks, they do not have happy endings. There's mention of suicide. There is a medicalization talk of a transgender person who then speaks out against her own transgender folks. There's some people who committed very heinous crimes. This is not to condone those crimes or condemn the LGBTQI+ community as a whole. These are complex parts of our history. It's important we recognize and reckon with those while we celebrate the good. But I do get one common type of question, which is, why does it matter, right? Why should I care about a queer person in motorsport? Why can't we just treat these people as racers? So I want to address that from the get-go because I think it matters. I'm doing a whole presentation on it. But I do think we can look at motorsport as kind of a concentrated microcosm of society as a whole, specifically a very not quite progressive society. Motorsport is usually takes a little bit longer for everyone to get up to speed with changing times. So motorsport, it's a very Western invention. So when you think about the people in charge of Western society, probably thinking of a white man, probably thinking of someone who's in a heteronormative relationship, probably subscribes to some sort of Christian denomination for religion. That's kind of what you're going to find a lot of in motorsport as well. These are the people in charge. They're the people who've started racing kind of at the get-go. Motorsport enforces a lot of those stereotypes, whether intentionally or unintentionally. There are a lot of barriers to getting into racing. Generally, you need to have a lot of money. You probably need to start early. You need to then have access to race cars and go-karts and all kinds of things that really not a thing for a lot of people if you're not already wealthy. So when we talk about these queer folks like this, we're living in a time right now that is scary, I think, for a lot of people, for women, queer folks, members of the, people of color, the immigrant communities. And these people are all important and integral parts of who we are as people, right? They've been ostracized in American and European society. They've also been ostracized in motorsport. They have still persisted and continued to show up despite that. And I think it's not to say that they don't exist or are actively pushed out of racing. It's just the conditions for their success are a lot more difficult. When we recognize that and recognize the identity markers and the challenges that accompany those identity markers, we end up creating a little bit more of a cohesive world, and in motorsport gives us a little bit more sense of equality. We can recognize more folks like ourselves in racing. The I don't care about your identity, I just care if you're a good driver mindset really denies the fact that there is so much that is required to even get to racing, let alone be successful within it. I would love if one day we could end up in a racing world where everyone is evaluated on their merits of skill and kindness and not the amount of money they have or what they look like, but we are not in that time. So it's important to take a moment just to look at all of the folks who have pushed against those boundaries and come out on the other side successful, maybe not successful, but who have moved the needle forward in some substantial way. And that is going to bring us to Violette Morris. She is going to be the first we talk about. She is one of the most tokenized drivers that I think I have ever written about. Her life is packed with these salacious details that make really good clickbait headlines, even today. She was a lesbian and a sportswoman. She competed in countless disciplines, not just motorsport, but she did cut off her breasts in order to have better access to the steering wheel. She was also banned from competing shortly after due to violating moral standards. She was accused of murder in a high-profile case. She was a personal and honored guest of Adolf Hitler at the 1936 Olympics, and she would go on to become a vicious Nazi collaborator. But who was she and how did we end up there? Violette Morris was born in Paris in April of 1893 to a retired French cavalry captain and a Palestinian Arab immigrant. She spent most of her youth being raised by nuns in a convent. She did get married to a man and ended up divorcing him in 1923. When we look at her past today, we'd probably brand her a tomboy. She was active physically, she was strong, she loved sports. During World War I, she learned how to drive in order to become an ambulance driver, so she was active picking up folks on the battlefield. She kicked off professional careers after she finished her, She kicked off her professional career after she came back from the war, and she did everything. So racing, boxing, women's soccer, swimming, Greco-Roman wrestling, water polo, tennis, archery, literally if it was a sport, Violette Morris was going to do it. She had a motto at the time that translates to what Violette can do, a man can do, or what a man can do, a Violette can do, excuse me. And she participated in the first all-female Olympics in 1922, where she won 2 gold medals and a silver. She was also a boxing champion, so regularly winning bouts not just against women, but men as well. She made her racing debut in 1922, driving a Benjamin cycle car that you can see up here on a road race in France. She did so well that she was hired by a French automaker called BNC as a works driver. So this meant she got paid a salary. BNC took cars, built the cars, prepared the cars, brought them to the racetrack. All Violette had to do was get in and drive them. She won several races, not just in the women's category. Women were often segregated into their own sports. Violette wanted to compete against the men too. She won quite regularly. She even managed to start her own auto shop in Paris, so she repaired and helped build race cars. Then in 1928, things started to fall apart. In order to compete in any form of sport in France at the time, you needed to be a member of something called the Fédération Féminine Sportive de France. And that organization refused to renew her competition license before the 1928 Olympics. The reason they gave was her so-called lack of morals, which they basically meant her penchant for wearing men's clothing, her love of swearing. In fact, she smoked all the time, that she got into a fist fight with a referee during a soccer match, and the unsubstantiated allegation that she provided amphetamines to her competitors. She had her racing license revoked that same year because without a feminine racing license, or with a competition license, you couldn't have a racing license. So in 1930, she tried to sue, basically, to get her rights back. She alleged that her career had been killed off, that she was no longer able to make a living. Even her, racing shop that she had, was having problems. Unfortunately, she was up against some of the best lawyers at the time, many of whom were early proto-feminists in France. Those feminists went and dug out a ruling, very obscure one from the 1800s, that said women are not allowed to wear trousers. So on those grounds, Violette had her appeal denied. She no longer had her racing license. I think it's very ironic that these are people who are supposed to be helping women and instead are judging one. Her sexuality as a lesbian was also brought up in the trial, not as a specific, marker of her supposed amorality, but as kind of evidence of a lifestyle that they did not necessarily agree with. She lost the suit, and after the trial, told reporters, "We live in a country made rotten by money and scandals, ruled by speechifiers, schemers, and cowards. This country of little people is not worthy of its elders, not worthy of survival. Someday its decay will bring it to the level of a slave, but if I'm still here, I won't be one of the slaves. Believe me, it's not in my temperament." Those would be prophetic words. Throughout the 1930s, she was quite regularly seen with the arts community in France. She was a good friend of Josephine Baker. A lot of those folks did end up cutting ties with her after she was accused of murder. She did shoot and kill a man who was trying to attack her and her partner with a knife. She was not jailed for that. They did let her off. It was deemed self-defense, but it was a very high-profile case, considering we're talking about a lesbian woman. in France in the 1930s. But then she got an invitation that would change her life. In 1936, Adolf Hitler asked her to be a personal guest of his at the Summer Olympics in Berlin, and Violette Morris accepted. She was France's greatest sportswoman throughout the 1920s and was routinely pushed out from society. She was not recognized for her ability. The one person who was going to recognize that was Hitler. We don't know what she got up to while she was there in Berlin, but we do know that when World War II kicked off in earnest, she did become a Nazi collaborator. She had driving skills. She could drive through battlefields. She knew how to do that from her time driving ambulances in World War I. So she was kind of exactly what they wanted. And she was unhappy enough with France that she would stay in France and report on French activities to the Germans. In 1944, in April, she was gunned down by the French resistance. They spotted her driving around in Normandy. At this point in time, we're preparing for D-Day. The French did not want this information about D-Day to get to the Germans. So they were executing as many collaborators or suspected collaborators that they could find. They spotted Violette in her car, tampered with the engine, and when she broke down on the side of the road, members of the French resistance appeared and killed her, as well as a family that she was driving with, alongside their 2 children, they were deemed Nazi collaborators as well. The best sportswoman in France was buried in an unmarked communal grave, and she is generally not remembered today unless we are discussing her in that salacious light that I mentioned. I don't want to excuse her transgressions. Obviously, she did a lot of horrible things, but I do think it is critical to understand why that happened and how we end up at this point. She was banned from the sporting events that brought her meaning. She was routinely ostracized from society, that she had nothing in France really left for her. The one person who saw something in her was Adolf Hitler. Her story has all of the now recognized markers of the radicalization playbook. It's not totally shocking that this is what would happen to her. And unfortunately, she does remain one of the very first examples of a queer person in the racing community. I love what she did in motorsport, the audacity to remove her own breasts. I think just to be better at racing is a high level of dedication. It is absolutely tragic that she went down the path she did. And now we will fast forward just a couple decades to talk about Roberta Cowell. Roberta was a transgender woman and was the first woman in Britain to undergo gender-affirming surgery back in 1951. She was a racer before and after that transition surgery. I do want to hedge, her story is complex. She will come out later in her life to speak out against transgender-affirming surgeries, but she did begin racing as a young child. She went to an all-boys school, picked it up there, got into motorcycles, got into cars, and learned how to fly. She was drafted into the Air Force during the start of World War II. So even though she did get motion sickness, she was regularly going up and flying. She married a woman named Diana, and then in 1944, November, she experienced something that would kind of change the direction of her life. She had her airplane shot down by the Germans. She landed safely. She was unharmed, but she was captured and made a prisoner of war. I won't go so far as to say that Roberta blamed that experience of being a prisoner of war for her later transition, but she does speak about it in her autobiography quite regularly. She talks about the severe distress she experienced, obviously, as one would as a prisoner of war, but also this cognitive dissonance she experienced. A lot of the other fellow prisoners would put on plays. Someone would be the woman. She refused to dress up as a woman. She wouldn't do it while she was a prisoner of war. After the war, she makes it home. She is safe. She is sound. She returns to her wife. She returns to her children. And then she sees this movie called Mine Own Executioner. This is a war film that features an airplane gunned down, and Roberta begins to experience traumatic flashbacks. It sends her to a therapist for the first time in her life. And there she finds basically that her therapist has told her her unconscious mind was predominantly female. She says she was aware of this all her life, but that it wasn't put to her so explicitly until this point in time. In 1950, she divorced her wife and started taking large doses of estrogen while still living as a man. But she had read about a British physician named Michael Dillon. Michael Dillon was a trans man, one of the first to undergo gender-affirming surgery to become a man. And Roberta realized that was something she wanted. She wanted to live as a woman. At the time, getting that surgery was impossible. Britain was organized by something that they called mayhem laws, and these laws prevented anyone from maiming someone else. So if you were technically a healthy person, you could not ask to undergo an elective surgery, specifically not to remove your testicles. So there was no one who would do this surgery for her. So Roberta goes to Michael Dillon. Michael Dillon is a physician, knows about what Roberta is going through, and he removes her testicles for her. She is able to then go to a gynecologist to receive documentation that says she's intersex, which then allows her to go to the government to receive a birth certificate that says she is a female, which then allows her to undergo transition surgery. It was a whole complicated mess. During this time, she did step away from racing. She had her businesses and her race team that she was running go under, and her gender change also kind of discounted her from motorsport. Women not really encouraged to compete in professional Grand Prix racing, which is what she wanted to do. But as her story kind of gets leaked to the press, she starts to get notoriety. This is the era of Christine Jorgensen, who was also, this sensational transgender woman. People couldn't believe this. Roberta gets kind of the same treatment, and she begins to sell her story and photos to the press. So folks are hearing all about who she is for the first time in her life. They were fascinated by the fact that she had lived a life with traditional markers of heterosexual masculinity, that she was married, had children, served in combat during World War II. I mean, this was something that people thought, that's a man. And she was choosing instead to live as a woman because she felt that's who she was. She was able to sell that story. It gave her the money and the notoriety she needed to be able to compete in the amateur racing scene in England and a little bit in Europe. She won the 1957 Chelsea Walsh Hill Climb, which is basically you drive as fast as you possibly can up a mountain. She took victory. That's an impressive thing for folks even today to do. So she made headlines for that and was able to continue racing through into the 1970s. Unfortunately, around this time, the novelty of her transition had begun to dry up. She was not able to sell photos and stories to newspapers, and she was finding it very difficult to get a job, to find somewhere to live. People were no longer accepting of her. And around this time, she also begins to now speak to newspapers about the so-called freaks that she has deemed some transgender folks. Roberta changes her story at this point in her life. She says that she was born with abnormal chromosomes, that she was intersex from the very get-go, that she did not receive that intersex diagnosis by getting surgery, and basically starts to speak out. If you are a person with normal chromosomes, you should not be undergoing this surgery. This kills off the goodwill that she had within the LGBTQI+ community, and she ended up kind of spending the rest of her life alone in government housing until she died in 2011 at age 93. So we have, again, a story here that is not a happy ending. Someone who had such a good trajectory, who was doing incredible things, and who kind of pushed back against that. But I do want to say Roberta did wonders for the amateur racing scene in terms of acceptability, especially in England. We're going to see this kind of come up again and again, even later when we talk about another hill climb racer at the end of this presentation. So there were some positive impacts that she did have. The next two drivers we're going to talk about, we know the least about, but we're going to start chronologically with Mario Manuel Veloso de Araujo Cabral, who's a Portuguese racing driver born in 1934. He competed in Formula One for about 5 years and would only come out as bisexual late in his life when he was in his 80s. He is still the only bisexual person we know of who competed in Formula One racing. So he was a very wealthy man, came from money, wanted to get into a very daring hobby, an expensive hobby. Racing is exactly that. So he started to enter Formula One, entered 5 Grand Prix over the course of 5 years, retired from 3. He qualified for 4 of the races, retired from 3 of them. And when he did finish in his very first race, he finished in 10th. So a strong finish. It wasn't worth any points at that time, but it was still recognized as like he did well. His racing career was halted briefly in 1961. He was made to do mandatory military service by the Portuguese army. When he returned, he had a very nasty accident. So he ended up stepping away from open wheel racing and going more into endurance cars and sports car racing. But he did leave motorsport behind for good in 1975. We didn't hear much from him in the intervening decades, but in 2009, when he was 75 years old, Mario came out as bisexual. He chose to spend the last 11 years of his life with this knowledge being made public, and he did pass away in 2020 at the age of 86. He's now kind of been lumped into a group of gay drivers, and I do think it does a disservice to what he chose to do in his last 10 years of his life. He wanted this known, the specific part of his identity. There is a tendency for a lot of folks to want to lump bisexual folks into one category or the other. So I did want to put him in here just as a reminder that this is what he chose, right? He spoke out about this. It was one of the last things he did in public. And that is something we should honor. That brings us now to Mike Butler, another Formula One driver, the first questionably openly gay man in Formula One. We're going to talk about what that means here in a second. Michael Simon Brinley Bream Butler was born in Egypt to a very well-known British family, and that was in 1940. By the 1960s, he had established a very strong racing career in lower junior disciplines to Formula One, so Formula 3 and Formula 2. He moved up to F1 in 1971, and when he did, he made waves, not for his performance or his sexuality, but because of the way he got his money, which was that he asked a bunch of his stockbroker friends basically to invest in him, and they all wanted their name on his team that he entered. So his racing team was called Clark Mordaunt Guthrie Durlacher Racing in 1973, which earned him his car the nickname the Stockbroker Special. He competed in 29 different races in Formula One. He qualified for and started 28 of those, but his performances were never super great. He got into F1 because he bought his own car. If you are able to buy a car as a random person, it is generally because it is an outdated car. He's operating, he had money from his friends, but it's still a shoestring budget with a very small workforce helping him. But he did have a good time. His best finish was 7th place in the 1973 Spanish Grand Prix. Again, only the top 6 finishers in F1 at this time got points, so he didn't get any, but he was close. And unfortunately, he did step away from racing in 1973. At this time, there was a huge oil crisis that wiped out the finances of everyone in the entire world, including his stockbroker buddies who were funding his career. He did one more outing as a race car driver in 1974 at an endurance race at Brands Hatch in England, and then that was it. Whether or not Mike was out during his career depends on who you ask. His good friend Ian Phillips, who used to be the editor of Autosport magazine, said that he was semi-closeted in the sense that the people close to him in the racing world did know he was gay. He did also show up to the track with women in an attempt to kind of throw off the scent. So folks, according to Ian Phillips, no one was expecting a Formula One driver to be gay. So when he brought those women, everyone just kind of said, okay, that's his thing. But also some folks did know. So whether or not we can call him the first openly gay driver in Formula One, It's a little strange, but I'm going to give it to him anyway. Unfortunately, in 1974, after he retired, he fell off the map and only emerged again in 1988 in Los Angeles, where he died. He suffered from complications due to AIDS and passed away at age 48. We're going to talk about another openly queer F1 driver in a moment, but I do want to give Mike his kudos because he was, he is the first openly queer person to have competed in Formula One in a top-level touring series in a time that was, unthinkable. And I do wish we could hear more from him, both about his racing and his experiences as a gay man in Formula One, even about his experiences with AIDS in a generation where so many queer people were wiped out by a terrible disease, and what that experience was. Now we have Lella Lombardi, the most successful woman in Formula One history, the first and so far only open lesbian in Formula One history. She is also the most recent woman to compete in Formula One. So she retired or stepped away from F1 in 1976. It's been a while. She was the second woman to ever enter Formula One. She was Italian, openly queer, traveled with her partner, and carved out a space for herself in F1. She was born to a working class family in 1941 and learned to drive because her family were butchers and someone needed to drive the delivery van. They got their daughter. She started to get into go-karting, then moved her way up to open wheel, and in 1974 tried her hand at F1 for the first time in a privately entered car. It did not go well, but she did speak about that experience with a gentleman named Count Vittorio Zanon over the winter. Count Vittorio Zanon owned the Lavazza Coffee Company. He loved what she was about and said, if you can find a car next year, I will pay for you to race. And that is just what she did. She signed a deal with a team called March. March did things a little differently. F1 at this point in time in the 70s was primarily made up of teams like Ferrari, these teams that had road car divisions and also race car teams. So they had a lot of supplies, a lot of manufacturing prowess. March was just a race team. March bought almost all of its parts from other people and tried not to make anything itself. It was a low-cost option for drivers to get into Formula One, but they did have to bring money in order to do so. So a lot of drivers got their start here, including guys like world champion Niki Lauda. Lella Lombardi was one of those in 1975. Unfortunately, March was only as good as the drivers in the cars and the engineers who fixed them. And Lella Lombardi, when she got hit behind the wheel, was complaining of a diabolical handling problem. And the team refused to investigate it. They did not believe a woman could know anything about Formula One, about engineering. They were offended that she dared suggest their car was not perfect. So they never looked into it. Her car was given later to a man named Ronnie Peterson, exact same car. He had the same exact diabolical handling problems. When they tore the car down, because they did listen to him, they found a giant crack in the bulkhead of this car. So this was what was causing this handling problem. Lella Lombardi knew that, but no one would look at it for her. Despite that, in 1975, she did score points. It was a half of a point at the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. That race filled with tragedy. Several folks, some marshals and some journalists were killed when a car leaped over the barriers and killed them. The race was ended early. It was not enough to justify a full points awarding for everyone. So Lella, who was in 6th place, the last points paying position, got her half of a point. She remains the only woman in Formula One to ever score points. She entered 17 races, qualified for and started 12 of them, finished 7 of those events. No woman has started a Grand Prix since then, 1976. She is generally remembered for her accomplishments as a driver, but she was also openly queer. She was a lesbian. She traveled with her partner Fiorenza. They did not make a secret of this, right? They were very, very open about it. And she nevertheless found a place for herself in the racing world. Her March team may not have respected her engineering input, but a lot of the drivers did find Lella fantastic. They thought she was a great driver and trusted her when they were racing around her, which is probably the highest compliment you can give someone in the racing world. This was in an era, again, where LGBTQI plus relationships are not accepted, where women in motorsport, in fact, were banned from being in the paddock in places like the United States. So she is a trailblazer in so many senses of the word. She did pass away in 1992. She had breast cancer. She did not take the time to write an autobiography, which I wish she would have, because I know she has a crazy story. But she, again, changed the name of the game and remains today still the last and most recent openly queer person to have raced in Formula One. That brings us now, we're going to America. We're going to talk about Hurley Haywood, who seemed like the prototypical masculine race car driver. He was sponsored by Penthouse. He was regularly pictured with beautiful blondes at the racetrack. That all concealed the part of his identity he did not share with anyone, which was that he was gay throughout that entire period of time. Haywood was born in Chicago, 1948. He started racing in the 60s. And when it came to endurance racing, there have been few American drivers who have had such a level of international success. In 1971, he won his first title in the IMSA GT series. Extra impressive because he was a rookie. In 1970, the year prior, he was in Vietnam serving a tour of duty. Came back, got behind the wheel, won a championship. In 1972, he was promoted to prototype driver, so the very top level of endurance racing cars. He went on to win the 24 Hours of Daytona in 1972, 73, 74, 77, 79, and 91. He won class in 72, overall in the rest of those years. Only one other driver in all of history has gotten 5 wins at Daytona overall, and that is Scott Pruitt. Hurley Haywood remains one of them. He won the 12 Hours of Sebring, also in Florida, 2 different times. Obviously, he's racing for Porsche. Porsche's an international team. Porsche likes the sound of his skill, so they invite him to come to Europe to compete, including in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In 1977, his first outing behind the wheel at Le Mans, he won overall, and went on to win again in 1983 and 1994. Again, this makes him one of the most successful American endurance drivers in the international community ever. He was a fairly regular part of the racing scene as well until 2012 when he decided to retire. But he made headlines again in 2018, and that is when he came out. That year, he was releasing an autobiography where this is basically where he I don't want to say confesses, but shares with the world that he was gay. The reason he decided to do so, this is a man who, his mantra was, "My private life is private," for a reason. He accepted a phone interview with a high school student. And this student, he said, asked really great questions, knew a lot about racing, but about halfway through the tone changed. Now, if you knew a lot about motorsport, you probably suspected Hurley Haywood was gay. He, aside from kind of the sponsors and the models that he posed with, you never saw a woman with him. You often saw him in his personal life with men. So this student says, "How did you do it? How did you keep it a secret? How did you manage to do this? How did you manage this identity in motorsport? Please help me. I'm thinking of taking my life." Hurley Haywood talks him down from a ledge, gets a call from this kid's mother 18 months later to say, "You saved his life. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to him." And he decides at this point, I need to share my story. He would say, if I could save one kid, maybe I could save 5, maybe 100. So he decides to write his autobiography, publishes his autobiography, It comes out as well alongside a documentary that was produced by Patrick Dempsey, of all people. And he used this opportunity not only to speak more about his sexuality, but about mental health. One of Hurley Haywood's close friends and longtime co-drivers was a gentleman named Peter Gregg. And when Peter Gregg was 40 years old, he took his life. He had been involved in a racing accident that had dramatically impacted, a road accident that had dramatically impacted his racing skill. Hurley says he saw the signs, but he didn't recognize them. He knew that Peter Gregg's mother had also been a depressed person. On Peter Gregg's 7th birthday, she left the house to buy him a cake, and on the way home, set that cake down on a subway platform and stepped in front of a train. Hurley says, in the conversations they had, he could tell something was wrong and didn't know what. So he takes his autobiography and this documentary to talk about who he is as a queer person and to talk about the signs that you can recognize with suicide and mental health. I don't want to say that they're like completely related, but mental health and sexuality are two still to this day kind of taboo topics in motorsport. We can thank Hurley Haywood for opening the doors to those conversations to, here is an incredible driver, absolutely massively successful. He was gay that whole time. Some folks knew, some folks didn't. And he was still really good, so it didn't matter. And then with mental health as well, if you follow Formula One, you know the current reigning world champion, Lando Norris, is open about his mental health, talks about the struggles that he has faced with the pressures. That is because men like Hurley Haywood took that time to do it. So we have him to thank for those conversations. And speaking of F1, if you know anything about F1, you probably know Michael Schumacher, 7-time world champion, record setter for wins, podiums, pole positions, and all kinds of goodies. Michael is just one of several of the Schumacher family to race. His younger brother, Ralph, also competed in Formula One. Ralph was born in Germany in 1975, started go-karting at his family's go-kart track, worked his way up the ranks, and in 1997 made his debut in Formula One. He did retire in 2007, but during those 11 years he competed, he won 6 times and got 27 podiums. So he's not his brother, but if we were evaluating him outside of Schumacher terms, 6 wins is pretty dang good. So he was no slouch. After F1, he went to a German touring car series, stayed for a few years, but then did retire. However, Ralph is still very present in Formula One. He is a pundit. You can hear his hot takes on Sky Sports Germany that often get translated and written about in English. In 2024, Ralph shared a photo on Instagram of him and his partner, Etienne, with a caption that read, "The most beautiful thing in life is when you have the right partner by your side with whom you can share everything." This kicks up a lot of speculation as to, does he actually mean partner in that sense? Several folks who are friends with Ralph did share on their own Instagram posts, "We respect him for coming out." So this did confirm it. His son was also very supportive. It was very sweet. And to me, this signals a big changing tide in racing. Ralph is respected in Formula One. He is still in the paddock every single race weekend. He's talking to everyone involved. He's part of the Schumacher family. This man is a legend. It would have been very easy for him to have kept that part of himself hidden, especially with his brother kind of being the bigger of the two and the current situation with Michael not being well. But he chose, Ralph, to live his truth. I was covering his announcement quite regularly for my job at the time. I won't say that every response was positive, but I will say that I was shocked by the amount of people who were willing to listen and learn. Ralph was married to a woman for 15 years. They had a son together. People had never considered this before. That, I think to anyone who is familiar with the queer community, some folks engage in a heterosexual relationship for very long periods of time, not quite open about who they are. For some folks, this was the first time they had ever heard of it and wanted to wrap their heads around it. And it opened up a lot of conversation on that sense. It helps that Ralph is still present. It helps that he is speaking every weekend, sharing his hot takes. It's more what he is known for than his sexuality. But it was very nice to see people challenging their deeply held assumptions about the racing world and being positive in a way that I don't think I quite expected from some of the European masculine sect to begin with. And that brings us now to Charlie Martin. Charlie Martin was born in 1981 in the United Kingdom. She is now one of the most prominent advocates for LGBTQIA rights in motorsport and overall. Charlie is a transgender woman, and when she first started racing in 2006, she did so under her birth gender, which was male. She began as a hill climb racer, so driving as fast as she could up the sides of a mountain. After competing in England, she started to go over to France, but in 2012, she stepped away from racing altogether. She chose to undergo gender-affirming surgery. Now, Charlie was part of an amateur racing scene. The amateur racing scene is very small, very close-knit, often not progressive. And so there's a very strong masculinity in that, particularly because these are people who work on their cars, race their cars, drive their cars to and from these events. It's kind of a very traditional heteronormative world. Charlie went through this surgery and assumed she would never come back to racing. In September of 2012, she turned up at an event as a spectator. She sent a couple of messages to some friends before she got there to say, hey, this is why I have not been around. I'm gonna look a little different. I'm gonna sound a little different. I do wanna come say hi. She was welcomed back with open arms by her friends, by her competitors. She decided from that point she was coming back. 2013, she committed to competing in France in the entirety of the French Hill Climb Championship. So she's building her car, putting it on a truck, shipping it over, driving it herself to France, racing it, taking it home and doing the repairs. She's doing it all. It was kind of genuinely incredible. She has since moved on. She's progressed. She's done touring cars. She has aspirations to race in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, is getting closer to that all the time. And she is also a huge advocate for LGBTQI rights. That is a significant part of who she is and what she does. She likes to tell a story. I spoke to her once and she told me this in this Ginetta GT5 championship that she was in. There was a race in June. She made Pride Month stickers and made it known that she had them. If you want to put them on your car, come ask me, I'll give you one. She expected a couple folks to come ask. She did not expect to run out of all 130 stickers that she printed that weekend. People came flocking to her, competitors, fans, even the guy who drove the safety car said, I want that on our safety car. It was kind of the first step for her to realize people want to hear this. She is an ambassador for an organization called Racing Pride that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. She is very open about trans rights, which is great, especially in the United Kingdom. There is a lot of transphobia, I mean, around the world, but it's wonderful to see her doing this and that she is accepted in motorsport as a successful driver as well as an activist. She has really done a lot to open minds and open hearts in the racing community in the last couple of years, and that is something I love to see. When I was making this presentation, I had a problem. There were so many people I wanted to include that I was running out of space. So I do want to give a couple shout outs to other pioneers here in the LGBTQIA community, starting with Helen Van Zuylen. She's the first noted woman to ever compete in a motor race, first one to ever do it. She was born in Paris in 1863. She was a member of the Rothschild family. She had a whole lot of money and she spent a lot of her life with her partner. She was married to a man, but she had a partner she loved to spend time with. They wrote love poems together. So she was complex in the sexuality realm. People call her a lesbian. She wasn't. People call her bisexual. I don't think she identified as anything. Those terms really weren't a thing at that point. But again, first woman to ever compete in a motor race, part of the queer community. Caitlyn Jenner, you probably know Caitlyn Jenner, whose children include the likes of Kendall and Kylie Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner, gold medalist in the Olympics, raced in the IMSA Camel GT series in the 1980s. She transitioned, now lives as a woman, and for a brief period of time owned a team in the W Series, which was an all-female racing series. Michelle Duff was a Canadian motorcycle racer in the 1960s who competed in classes of motorcycle racing all around the world. She transitioned in 1984 to live the rest of her life as a woman. She wrote a biography after that point and doesn't talk about that experience, which drives me crazy, but she's still a legend. George Aarons III we don't know much about him. We know that he was heir to the American Tobacco Company fortune. We know that his family members were involved in motorsport in the early 1900s in the United States. We know that he raced a little bit on the amateur level in the 1950s, but what George really did was give money to teams that needed it. He is responsible for helping fund the race team that brought Ferrari to America for the first time, which introduced that whole company here. George was married, did have children. Later in his life, he engaged in a relationship with a fellow racer named David Cunningham, and so he was a gay man. Ed Flemke Jr. was a stock car racer. He is so far the first and only known LGBTQIA+ winner of a NASCAR sanctioned event. He competed in the NASCAR Whelen Modified Tour between 1988 and 2013, and in 2021, he married his longtime boyfriend. And Steven Rhodes, the youngest on our list of former drivers, came out as gay when he was 17 years old. 1 year later, he made his debut in the NASCAR Trucks Series. That made him the first openly queer person to compete in NASCAR since Lella Lombardi competed in one NASCAR event in 1976. All of these folks have contributed something special to the acceptance and overall appreciation of members of the queer community in motorsport. Now, racing still is an environment laden with masculine and heterosexual overtones. Ask me how I know. I've been covering it for 10 years. The last decade or so, though, there have been a lot of organizations that have come out to support members of the LGBTQI+ community, which I have been very happy to see. The major organization, one of the first, is Racing Pride. Racing Pride is a global organization and a charity designed to positively promote LGBTQI+ inclusivity through motorsport. So that has included everything from promoting the contributions of people, queer folks who competed in racing in the past, or celebrating those who do now. It has included forging partnerships with race teams in Formula One to share these goals together, to connect queer members of the racing community together, and to support them financially as they need it. Out Motorsports here in the United States is more of an amateur organization. They put on track days, little rally crosses, autocrosses, and will also help you fund your way to one of their events. It is a safe, inclusive space for people who otherwise feel uncomfortable getting their foot in the door. There have also been a lot of fan-led conversations, which I love to see, like my friends at the Gay Racing Podcast who, this is part of their identity, it's part of what they talk about, and they still have very incisive, wonderful commentary on the motorsport scene, which has really helped, I think, a lot of folks have these conversations. In NASCAR, there's also the Drive for Diversity program, which is designed to promote and help folks from minority communities get into motorsport. So that has included women, members of the queer community, immigrants, folks from other countries, people of color, etc. So we are seeing changing tides. And we are seeing so many active drivers now in the community, the queer community who are in motorsport. Travis Schumacher, active in drag racing. He's in the top level of drag racing in the NHRA called Top Fuel. That makes him one of the first openly queer drivers to compete in the top level of an American touring car racing series. Devin Rousey started in go-karts before moving to dirt modifieds, which got him into stock car racing in ARCA and in NASCAR. When he competed in ARCA, that made him the first openly gay driver to do so. Abby Eaton, I will say she has somewhat stepped away from active competition, but she is a performance coach now and is helping manage young drivers. She came out as a lesbian when she was 17, and that was part of her identity as she grew up in racing. If you watch the Grand Tour with Jeremy Clarkson, James May, and Richard Hammond, she was their test driver for several seasons, so they brought her on for that, which was great. Richard Morris, sports car racing driver. He just won the European Sports Prototype Cup Championship, and he also founded Racing Pride, so he has done a lot of fabulous work. Zach Heron, a stock car driver from California, he was involved in racing, stepped away when he came out because he wanted to understand how his identity intersected with his career, and has since come back. He was awarded NASCAR's Drive for Diversity Award in 2024. And finally, we have Sarah Moore, the very first woman to win the Brit Car Endurance Championship. She's also a very active member of Racing Pride and helping to support young drivers who are coming out as queer in the racing community. What's great about all of these folks is how open they are. They're celebrating this, and they are using their identity as a way to help other people who maybe don't feel as confident. That is paving the way for future generations. Again, this is all in like the last 10 years, and it warms my heart to see, especially because so many of these folks are so successful. So there is no argument of, they weren't good, but they were gay, so we have to care. They were both, so we can care extra. I won't claim everything is perfect, obviously. We do live in a world that is very hostile to anyone who is not kind of this white, male, Christian, heteronormative. That's how things go, but we have seen so much progress in this last decade that phenomenal. It makes me so happy to see. But that is all from me today. I want to thank you guys so much for coming.